Hey guys, so I'm going to talk to you all about the thing that Andrew and I actually build and work on, which is a product called TakeShape. So we're pretty steeped in GraphQL on multiple fronts. So we use GraphQL to actually build our application. So we use it to build TakeShape. And then our users are primarily interacting with TakeShape through GraphQL. So we have an interesting relationship with the technology and what we do with it. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to TakeShape, explain why we picked GraphQL as one of our core technologies for our stack and for our users, and then I'm going to tie GraphQL and headless CMS together and show you how to build a site using both of those technologies. So what is TakeShape? So TakeShape is a headless GraphQL CMS, and I'll just break that down for you. So basically headless, meaning that it's decoupled from presentation. So content decoupled from actual presentation. The authoring environment's totally separate and disconnected from the website that your users are actually interacting with. And then because your artifact is actually a pre-rendered HTML, CSS, and JavaScript bundle, you get the benefits of having things like more performance, having your experience be more secure and more scalable for your users. And GraphQL. So GraphQL is core to TakeShape. Every time you interact with content on TakeShape, you're interacting with GraphQL in some way. And then a CMS. I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with that, but you might be working with people that feel more comfortable interacting with something visual. So we provide an interface for non-technical users to manage content on. And we also built a static site generator, but we think of it more like a static content generator in that it's a step lower of an abstraction from a static site generator. You can use it as a way to generate static sites, but we wanted to keep things simple, and we basically believe in GraphQL queries plus templates equal HTML. So we let you bring your own build system to handle how you want to compile your JavaScript and CSS, however you like. And then we take care of the fundamentals of querying and template rendering. So we think that this combo of headless CMS, GraphQL, and static site generation makes for a pretty sweet CMS for the JAMstack. So Jam is sweet. That's my one small joke. Thank you. So what does TakeShape actually look like, and what does all of this stuff actually mean? So with TakeShape, you model content, you create content, you query for content, so you're developing with it, you're writing GraphQL queries, you're using the result of your queries in HTML templates, and then your users are actually using your site. So we kind of love GraphQL, and we're really glad that we decided to build on top of GraphQL. But when we first started planning TakeShape 2.5 years ago, we really agonized over this decision. We weren't sure if we should start with a REST endpoint, a GraphQL endpoint, or maybe a Falcor endpoint. Anybody remember Falcor? At the time, we felt certain that we were going to need basically all the endpoints. Like every endpoint, I think we're going to need it. Developers, we want to accommodate them in every way possible. But luckily, I think we ended up being mistaken in that, and GraphQL feels like the right way to have gone. And there were during our deliberation process, there were some pros and cons that we thought about when we were trying to make a decision. So on the con side, GraphQL was relatively new and not yet widely adopted. The first stable release for GraphQL was in October of 2016, and we started speccing and planning for TakeShape in August of 2016. So we were kind of like working with something that wasn't finalized at that point. But we had a lot of belief that it was going to get there. Facebook also had really interesting licensing terms that were sort of concerning around the application of their patents, but luckily that's all been resolved, which is really great. So now things like GraphQL and React are free for everybody to use and unrestricted by patents, which is great. So thank you, Facebook, for fixing both GraphQL and React, which are two core parts of our stack. And REST was really familiar with everybody. Like, could we really convince people to use GraphQL, something that they weren't really familiar with? But on the flip side of that, in the pros column, we were having flashbacks of wrestling with REST endpoints, trying to mash up custom data, trying to tie together a bunch of APIs or retrieve content from multiple content entities at once. And this was exactly why Facebook created GraphQL. So we felt pretty comfortable and confident with their overall technical approach. We really liked it. And then just trying to mess around with REST APIs and understand how they were actually working, can be an opaque experience. If you've ever used an API-based CMS before and you weren't sure what fields you were actually going to get back so that you could use them in your inside of your content experience, that was the problem that we were trying to really solve, and we found that GraphQL solved that for us. So in the end, it came down to a few things. Like probably everybody here, we really like working with new technologies much more than we like working with old and crufty technologies. That was something that really was appealing to us. And to be honest, GraphQL drastically reduced the amount of code that we needed to write to actually get our API up and off the ground. So it was a bit of a selfish decision in some ways, and that meant that we could build our app a lot faster. And then the self-documenting features of GraphQL drastically simplified the learning curve for our developer users. And since we're building a CMS and a tool where everyone's API is really different from one another and really up to their particular circumstance and how they're being creative, it was really important that the learning curve be not be steep on anybody's API that they were going to have to deal with. And most importantly, we were our own guinea pigs. I'm a front-end developer, and I found GraphQL queries to be easier for people like myself to write and understand. While I was running an agency, we had already been building static websites and using the JAMstack approach. And we knew we wanted to build a CMS for people that thought like us and were thinking along the same lines that we were and trying to solve the same kinds of problems that we were trying to solve. So fast forward to today, and it seems like we chose wisely when we went with GraphQL. So if you're working with content and you aren't making it available via GraphQL, it really seems like you're at a disadvantage to other folks. And I mean, look at it. It's nice to look at. I mean, you guys saw some of it with some GraphQL queries that Andrew was writing. It's nice to look at, and it's easy to understand, and you can really just read it and understand from query to kind of finished product what you're going to be getting and what you're going to be using it for. So how do we use GraphQL to build TakeShape? So TakeShape is really built entirely around a GraphQL API. It's not just the way that we interface with other developers. We actually use it to build the entire application. It's not like a bolt-on API that came later. It's the core of what we do. TakeShape uses that same GraphQL API that we make available to our users for when they're building, our developer users for when they're building things, to power everything that we do. So it powers the React application that is the web client. It powers the CLI tools and the static site generator. It's how the entire app basically runs. So we're basically using a GraphQL API to build a GraphQL CMS and then provide a GraphQL API to other developers. It's like a meta. It feels like a fun thing that we're doing. So how do our developer end users actually utilize TakeShape and our GraphQL API? Well, they can make requests directly to our GraphQL endpoint. They can write GraphQL query files and then feed that into our static content generator. Or they can use a third party, like something like Gatsby.js, that have deep integrations with GraphQL and work nicely with GraphQL. And then they can make queries to our API that way. So there's really a bunch of ways that people can use it. So I'm going to give you a demo of how to build out your own GraphQL API with the tools that we provide inside TakeShape. So we're going to do that by building out a website. So I created this demo because I was really inspired by what one of our customers built. So one of our customers, Ramon, built this growth job list, and he reached out to us over Intercom, and he was like, "Hey, I've got some front-end development experience, and I have this idea for a startup, and I want to make this thing. I'm going to make it. I'm excited to use your tool." And we were like, "Great, that's awesome. Go at it." And a week and a half later, he built Growth Job List, and he was it was number 2 on Product Hunt, which was really exciting. So this is a job board. So I was inspired by him, so I decided that for this demo, I'm going to build a job board so that anybody who wants to create a JAMstack job board can use this. So this is going to be available up on TakeShape's GitHub repo, and it's also going to be a sample project that you can configure from inside TakeShape. So we're going to check out JAMstack job board today. So this is what we're going to build. It's basically a listing of JAMstack jobs from companies that love the JAMstack. So it's going to show off a couple of the different features of TakeShape and GraphQL and what you can actually do with it. All right, so we're going to jump into our code base. Actually, no, we're going to start by actually modeling out what we're going to do. So this is the part with the holding. So we're going to start by logging into TakeShape, creating a blank project, and then we're going to actually model out all of our content so that we can create a GraphQL API. So when you create a project in TakeShape, you're presented with this setup screen, and basically what you do with TakeShape is model content, create content, and then retrieve that content either via the API or using the static site generator. So we're going to just jump right in and start adding in content types to start to flesh out our website here. So if I look at what we have on the website, we've got a bunch of jobs. We have companies. Companies have logos. Jobs can sometimes be hot jams. And then we have this idea of a homepage. So I'm just going to start building things out. So if I want to create a company, I'm going to set it to be a taxonomy, and we'll talk more about that later. But things that companies have are names, and companies also have, let's see, they also have logos, and we probably want them to be required. We're going to have jobs. We're going to have more than one. A job is going to have a title. Jobs are also going to have a body to explain what the job is all about. We want to be able to make a job a hot jam. So we're going to use a switch, and we're going to have a nice hot jam switch that a content creator could actually turn on. And jobs should also be related to companies. So we're going to create a relationship between a job and a company. We've also got a home page. There's only one of those. A home page, let's see, what's on a home page? Well, we have a hero. We've got a heading. It's got some background images. And I see we've got some featured jobs. So we're going to make an object so we can kind of contain our hero. We're going to set up a heading. We're going to have background images. And then we're also going to have featured jobs. And there's multiple of them. The last thing that we might want is actually being able to name the site. So we're going to set up a site settings. Also, there's only one of these. Right now, we only have maybe a site title. But this might be a way that you would store and model out like a Google Analytics ID or Open Graph data that's fallback, allowing you to fall back when other content isn't set. So we're going to create that. All right, great. I'm going to call this site JAMstack job board, just like we have elsewhere. And we're going to start making content, make a new job. So we're going to say front and engineer. This is going to be a hot jam. We're going to make a new company. We'll just use our company. Now we want some assets. So assets are also a kind of content. So we're gonna I can't drag and drop. It's like my kryptonite. I am blaming Apple. All right. So we're going to create a new company. And then maybe we've got some content in there. So we need some content. Great. So we've got a job. We've got a company. We need a homepage. So we want to have a nice heading. We want to use a nice background image. Let's see, what do we have? We have a tilted jam jar. That looks pretty cool. So we're going to use that. And we're going to use our job as our front-end engineer job as our first feature job over there. All right, so now I've got all my content set up. Now, what's really cool is that while I was doing all that modeling, I was also at the same time creating the GraphQL API. So if we go over here and we click on View an API Explorer, we can see that same graphical interface that Andrew was showing you earlier. So we incorporated that into TakeShape to make it easier to actually build and work with the API. So we're going to get the site settings single content type, and we're going to retrieve that data, and we got it back. So that's great. So we have a site title. We can also get a jobs list. So we can get our job list really easily. We can get back our titles. We can get back our company. So company is a relationship, so we can actually dive deeper into that relationship and get back things like the company name. And we could even get back the logo or anything else we want. So we can see using Graphical that our API works, and we can get a feeling for how we're actually going to use it before we jump over into our code base. So now I'll jump over to look at our actual code base over here. So now we're flipping over to wanting to actually build out this website. So the TakeShape static site generator is configured using a YAML file. So we tried to be very light in terms of what the configuration is. The most important thing that you see here are the actual routes. So we allow you to define routes and hook those routes up to templates and GraphQL query files. So you can see the homepage here is going to render out on the route path. It's going to utilize the homepage HTML template, and it's going to run the homepage GraphQL query file and then combine the template and the response from that query file together. So let's actually run our environment. So I'm going to just initialize. I'm going to authenticate with the TakeShape service using the TakeShape CLI. So that's a good point. All right. So we've got JAMstack job board. All right. So what we did there was we just authenticated with the TakeShape service. We set up a couple. Files locally that actually with a token that actually allows the CLI to make connections to TakeShape and run the queries on our user's behalf. And now locally we have the site up and running with the content that we have that we were looking for from our API. So that's really neat. That's kind of cool. So let's flip over, and we can actually kind of explore these individual files. So if we open up, let's look at our job GraphQL file. So this will look kind of familiar from what you were seeing before inside Graphical. And so this is the same query that you would run inside of Graphical, but we have it locally as a GraphQL file. And just like the tooling that Andrew was showing you guys earlier, there's some neat tooling for VS Code and for IntelliJ that allow you to have some intelligence about what the schema actually is for your specific project. So when we initialized our project and we made that connection, and we created these GraphQL config files here that allows our tooling inside of our IDE to connect up to TakeShape and pull down the schema. And then we can get things like code completion. So if we wanted to pull down also the hot jam status, we could do that. And then we can actually run the queries from right inside our IDE. And that's pretty neat. So we can actually have some nice tooling that helps us get our job done a little bit faster. So that query kind of grabs our data. If we look back, we have an HTML file, and that's where our data is going to be rendered into. So if we look at our page for job, we can see how, we can see some of the same variable names in there. So we can see the company name, we can see the job title, and then you can see how that gets stitched together and actually renders out the final markup for the page. So that's sort of the thrust of how you build something very basic with TakeShape. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to actually deploy this thing out to Netlify so it can be a real website. So there you go. So we have a pretty neat one-click integration with Netlify. So we're going to switch projects and we're going to use the more exciting, more like fleshed out project with more content. We're going to actually reset this and delete it because we don't want to look at that. All right. So we're inside the more complicated, more interesting project. We've got more companies, we've got more jobs, and we want this to be a real live website. So we're gonna go over and we're gonna unlink it so you can see the full thing. We're gonna link our Netlify account. We're gonna authorize it. We're gonna start making static sites that we can actually publish this website to. So we're going to go and we're going to create a new static site. We're going to call it something nice. So we support publishing out to S3, Google Cloud Storage, an FTP provider, or Netlify right now. So we get to choose a destination. We're actually going to create a brand new one. You can optionally give our site on Netlify a name or a password. Netlify allows you to password protect, so we allow you to do that kind of right off the bat. We're just going to create that site for you. Netlify is going to come back with an image. We're going to save it. And now we've got a website that we can actually deploy to. So I'm just going to flip back over to my local environment. I'm going to reinitialize my local environment, but point it at this other project. So we get to select our other project. We get to select the static site that we want to actually deploy to. We're going to run this locally just to make sure everything looks good and we're OK. Yep, we've got a nice website. We've got all the content there. So we're ready to actually make it live and deploy it. So there it goes. It's going up. So we see that it actually published successfully. We're going to flip over to our Netlify console. All right, that looks like what we meant to deploy. Heuristic Villainy. There we go. And this was the site that we just deployed. So now it's live and up on the internet. So that's how quickly you can go from having an idea, modeling out the kind of content that you wanna work with, creating queries to get that content out of TakeShape, putting it together with some templates, and then deploying it out into the world and having everybody look at it. So yeah, so that's, I'm going to open this.
At the end, that static website is purely static, or is that GraphQL actually executing?
So that particular website is purely static. So we render the let's call it pre-rendered. But you can imagine running like a React application on that website, and then calling back to the TakeShape API directly, and then enriching the kind of content and the experience on the app with content coming straight off of TakeShape.
Gotcha.
How do you handle dynamic content in terms of like interactivity and buttons? Like for each of those HTML pages, would you be bootstrapping React all over again?
You mean like if you're building a React application on it?
Like if you wanted to have dynamic content, like more advanced buttons or forms or all types of stuff within the rendered HTML.
Yeah.
How would you handle that?
Well, I mean, you'd be building a React application that just runs like any other single page React application would at that point. So every time assuming that you're controlling, I guess, the state in the browser and the history in the browser with your React application, then you wouldn't necessarily be, rehydrating React every single time, a page changes or something like that. But if all of your pages were, if all of your pages needed to be loaded anew, then yeah, you'd be rehydrating React every time. But if you're building a single page React application and then you're talking back to the API, or you can do things like, we call it a static content generator because you can do things like render a bunch of content out as JSON, and then you can have sort of a JSON API that lives statically on the front end if you wanted to architect your application in that way. So there's definitely options in different ways to go.
Cool.
So in the demo earlier, you showed that some of the assets is being uploaded to the TakeShape console. And if there is an application that allow users to upload their own assets, how would that be managed?
So it's all content is content inside of TakeShape. So assets are the same kind of content type as everything else. So I think what you're maybe asking is like, is there a way to like moderate content? Is that what you're? Yeah. So right now, no. There's no kind of moderation. So if you had built an application on top of TakeShape to take user-generated content and upload it into the platform, it would be there. It would exist, but there would be there wouldn't necessarily be a moderation mechanism. Now you could actually model out an asset with a moderation mechanism in it, but there wouldn't necessarily be like a special interface for moderation or something like that. But you can, because all of the types in TakeShape are kind of, all the types are the same, you can actually modify those asset types with different kinds of fields. So if you wanted to have a checkbox or a switch that says, has this thing been moderated or not, you could actually modify the content type, and then your user-generated uploads just wouldn't have that switch flipped or whatnot. So you could actually create a kind of moderation queue in that way.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, guys.